Well, Matt, by my watch, it's 12:01, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Joe Bunnell. I'm Program Director for Watershed Management with Ohio State University Extension. And thank you all for connecting to the nonpoint source webinar series that we're hosting. This one is with Merritt Fry, who is Rivers and Habitat Program Director with River Network. And a little bit of a intro to Merritt. She is based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Is that still true, Merritt?
That's correct.
Reading off the web page. So she has 15 years of experience working with Clean Water Act and both at the federal and state levels. She focuses on water quality standards, 401 certification, pollution control permits, habitat restoration, drinking source water protection, and TMDLs, and she's got a lot of great experience at different scales, I guess you could say. Merritt, you've been executive director of Utah Rivers Council. You've also worked with Clean Water Network and NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council in DC. So she brings a lot of great experience from different levels and different scales to her position with River Network. And before I turn it over to you, Merritt, I want to just give a quick orientation to the website, to the event center. So most important for those of you who are participating and listening today is in the lower right-hand corner of the page that you're looking at, the website. You'll see there's a little chat box down in the lower right-hand corner. And right above that chat box, it says Send To, and then you have a drop-down menu, and you can select who you're going to send that to. You can send it to the presenter. Actually, I would prefer that you just send it to all attendees or all panelists. Either one is fine. And I'm not actually sure if you all have the same options that I do since I'm a panelist, but just send it to as many people as possible so as many as possible can see your question. I'm going to be fielding the questions throughout the presentation, and so go ahead and post your questions there, and I'll be watching out for them, and at appropriate times I'll pose those questions to Merritt so she can address them. If you have any questions, if you lose your audio or anything like that and you can't get back, you can send a message to Brian Weaver through the text, through the chat, and let him know that you're having problems. So, that being said, one other thing is that we will be posting an evaluation. Brian will post the link to the evaluation, probably at more than one point during the talk, certainly at the end. You can just click on that. I don't think it takes more than about a minute or two to fill it out, but it's very helpful both for us and for Merritt to see how she connected with her message. So with that, Merritt, I'm going to turn it over to you for the Clean Water Act 101 program.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for that introduction, Joe. It looks like we've got a pretty good-sized group on the phone now, so thanks, everybody, for coming. You're looking here at the title slide. Hopefully everybody's logged in on the WebEx. The title slide is kind of the summary of what we're going to do today. It's a 101 kind of very general overview of just a few of the core programs of the Clean Water Act that will be most helpful, kind of the most practical tools for people doing on-the-ground watershed work. There's a ton of programs in the Clean Water Act, so we had to kind of focus this down for a lunch hour presentation. But the important thing here is that this is a 101 presentation, so there's no stupid questions. There never are. There probably are more expert types in our midst as well, so hopefully people will feel free to share information using the chat if they have additional kind of ideas or thoughts about how some of these tools can be used at home. But know that what we're going to do today is largely just try to hit the 101 level. With that in mind, I'm going to do just a little quick survey to see who we have on the phone. Right above the chat box that Joe pointed out, there's a gray bar that has a couple buttons in it, and one of them is a hand. It looks like somebody kind of holding up their hand in a stop gesture. That's the raise your hand button, I guess you'd call it. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and if you can answer in the affirmative to those questions, hit that button and raise your hand. If you hit it again, you can unraise your hand. Just a little survey here to see if I'm hitting the right level of detail. I'm going to use some jargon, so don't be afraid. These are terms we'll define as we go through the presentation. But who on the phone or on WebEx here has been involved in their state's review of water quality standards? It's known as the triennial review. If you've been involved at all, maybe submitted public comments or gone to a hearing, use that raise your hand button to let me know that you've done that. Okay, it looks like a couple. Okay, we've got a small group of people. How many of you unraise your hand if you raised your hand there? How many of you have ever commented on a point source discharge permit, maybe a wastewater treatment plant or an industrial facility in your watershed? Okay, again, looks like maybe just a few, even a few fewer. All right. How many of you have received 319 grant funds, the non-point source funds that your state gives out for restoration or protection work? Okay, a lot more of you there. I kind of suspected that. All right. And lastly, how many of you have ever been involved in the total maximum daily load process, the TMDL process, whether that's commenting on a TMDL or helping to implement one maybe through your restoration work? Okay, even more. Okay. So it looks like the non-point source arena in the TMDL world is where a lot of you have been involved. So, okay, that's great. For those of you who didn't raise your hand, don't worry. Those are the things we're going to talk about here. For those of you who did, again, if you have information or ideas to share, use that chat function as we move through. One other general thing to point out before we dive in is we have people from several states on the phone today. I know we have at least Ohio and Minnesota, and we may have some other folks as well. So I'm going to give some examples as we go through, and they're going to come from Great Lakes states, definitely some Ohio and Minnesota examples, and also Indiana, I think, is the other state that I pulled some information from. Just know that these are just examples. Every state does things a little bit differently, but I wanted to have at least a few places where you could see something concrete from your home state and how all of this policy talk kind of gets translated at the local level. So if there's folks from other states, I apologize, but you'll get the general idea from looking at the examples I was able to pull. All right, so with that, let's talk here a little bit about what we're going to cover today. We're going to do a quick introduction to the Clean Water Act. Again, this is a beginner section, so just a very general kind of introduction. And then we're going to talk about 4 core programs: water quality standards, point source discharge permits, the non-point source control program, and TMDL restoration plans, or total maximum daily loads. So again, these are just a few of a lot of programs under the Clean Water Act. But in talking with folks like Joe, people who've been working with a lot of you all, these seem like some of the core programs to make sure that everybody had at least the introduction to. So you'll leave hopefully knowing a little bit about the overall vision and goals of the acts, the basic about these core programs, and have some ideas for engaging more with the 4 core programs. Because of the short nature, we're going to just try to kind of whet your appetite and hope that you leave with a few things that you want to follow up on as ideas for using these tools in your watershed. And with that in mind, we're going to end with where to find some more resources to dive in a little deeper on some of these issues if we've whet your appetite and you do want to dig in a little farther. So that's our basic agenda. Starting with that introduction here, I always like to start my presentations with this snippet from the Clean Water Act's overall objective. I love this objective, 1, because I'm a geek, and 2, because it's pretty visionary, pretty broad and sweeping when you think of a federal kind of piece of legislation. So you'll see here that the Act's objective is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our nation's waters. The reason I like to start with this is that you can make a couple points here that are important to keep in mind as we talk about some of these programs. The first is the fact that the objective includes the idea of restoring and maintaining our waters. So we often these days are talking a lot about programs like the TMDL program, which focuses on restoring places where we've seen some real problems. But it's important to remember that the Act places equal emphasis on the idea of maintaining quality where we have good, healthy aquatic systems. So keep that in your mind. The other important piece here is that we often tend to focus on the chemical quality of our waters. This is changing, but historically a lot of the work that's been done under the Clean Water Act has focused on things that you dip a sample bottle in the stream and you check the chemical issues. Maybe there's some toxic issues. Those kinds of things have really been at the forefront for good reason often. But you'll see here in the objective that it's much broader than that. Chemical, physical, and biological integrity really gets at all of the things that are important for healthy functioning rivers or wetlands or lake systems. So when we talk about things like water quality standards or TMDLs, it's important to keep in mind that we're looking at the health of the entire system, not just the amount of a particular metal in that system or whatever the one concern might be in a chemical situation. Two other general points to make here for background for our discussion today. It's important to keep in mind that the Clean Water Act is our national approach to protecting and restoring our waterways. It's a federal law, but much of the day-to-day work of that federal approach is delegated to the states. So, for example, the states establish their own water quality standards. When we talk about the standards program here next, you'll see that a lot of that day-to-day work is really done by your state. Now, that work is done within a process established by the U.S. EPA and under the review and approval or disapproval of U.S. EPA, but the state is really the one doing a lot of the heavy lifting. So the way that this works is, for the Clean Water Act, a lot of what U.S. EPA does is establish kind of the approach, the thresholds for what's acceptable, and they work with the states then to make sure that the state can develop something that meets those thresholds, those guidelines, but also is appropriate at the local, at the state level. So it builds in kind of a way to localize this federal vision. So each of the programs we'll talk about today is part of that tiered approach. The other thing to keep in mind with that approach, though, is that what the Clean Water Act really does is establish a national floor of protection. So again, if U.S. EPA is establishing kind of the direction of these programs and reviewing and approving or disapproving what the states do in terms of the delegated programs, that is establishing a floor of protection. It's saying we want to make sure that all across the country we have some consistency in terms of what we're doing to protect water quality. Part of this is just very practical need to stop pollution shopping, say. Make sure that dischargers couldn't necessarily, say, go to one state and say, hey, I can get weaker discharge limits in state A than you're willing to give me here in state B, and try to move around to find, the place where they can discharge the most. So that national floor kind of was meant to make sure that that couldn't happen. However, it's equally important to remember that the states are free to do more than what that floor requires, and to tailor the Act's programs to better fit or protect what the states and the people in those states most value about their rivers or wetlands or lakes. So the floor is important to protect everybody, but it's not a ceiling, it's a floor. The states can always go above and beyond what is required. So with that as some general background, I think I have just one other background slide here. Kind of like the objective, I like to also start with the Clean Water Act goals when we're talking about the General 101 sessions here. I've selected just three here that are most relevant to the programs we'll be talking about today. I like to talk about them for a couple reasons, one of which is that they're just so darn bold. These are paraphrasing the goals that are in the actual Clean Water Act, but you'll see here three pretty bold goals. The first is that Congress said that they wanted all of our waters to be fishable and swimmable. And by that, they didn't mean just that you could throw a hook into the river. It's that shorthand for language in the Act that's really about healthy aquatic ecosystems that can support aquatic life and waters that are safe for recreation. That's the swimmable piece. And they said not only did they want all of our waters, where attainable, to be fishable and swimmable, but they said they wanted that by 1983. Pretty remarkable deadline. The second one here said, and in addition to that, by 1985, we want to just eliminate pollution discharges to our waterways. And they also had a goal in there that said, right away, not even with a deadline out in the future, but immediately they wanted no discharge of toxics in toxic amounts. So those are pretty bold goals, probably not something that we would see written today, but that is still the national kind of goal of our water quality policy direction. So they're worth keeping in mind as we talk about details today. We tend to get into the weeds sometimes talking about parts per million and debating pollution discharge permit limits and BMP effectiveness, but this kind of puts it in context of where we're all really trying to head. I will say that sometimes these goals can be a little depressing as well because the deadlines have so long passed us by, but that doesn't make them any less compelling in terms of where we're really trying to get in terms of what we're doing with the Clean Water Act. In fact, arguably it makes it that much more urgent that we all really use the power of the Act to move in these directions. So that's just a little bit of a very general background on the Act as it relates to some of the programs we're going to talk about today. I'd like to dive into the 4 programs we're going to talk about today. I will say we have breaks for questions between each of these 4 program areas, so we can talk about any questions at that point. Or I'm sure that Joe will break in if there's anything that needs clarification as we go. But with that little background, here's the 4 programs we're going to talk about. I already touched on them on the agenda slide, but just to kind of orient you for the rest of the discussion. We're going to spend probably the most time on the first topic here, water quality standards, in part because they are the basis of everything else that we'll talk about and most of the programs in the Clean Water Act, and in part because it sounds like that is maybe one of the places where a lot of you have spent less time, a little more familiar maybe with the nonpoint source program and the TMDL program. So with that, I'm going to dive in on water quality standards. So the first kind of important core thing to know about the Water Quality Standards Program is that what the standards do is establish our, if you want to think about it in layman's terms, kind of the goals for our water bodies. So for every river, lake, stream, wetland, creek, whatever you think of as your home watershed, these water quality standards really establish the direction for every other Clean Water Act tool that you might want to use. What's beautiful about water quality standards and kind of amazing is that they are very site-specific and very closely tied to places on the ground. So a lot of what we'll talk about will seem very theoretical, but I'm going to try to show you how, particularly for folks who are working on the ground in a watershed, this is really very fundamental to the place where you're working to protect and restore water quality. So let's talk about the 3 pieces just generally, and then I'm going to walk through each of these with some examples that hopefully will clarify. So for water quality standards, there are 3 core pieces you see laid out here. The first is the idea of designated uses, sometimes called beneficial uses in some states, including some in the Great Lakes. So the idea behind designated uses is to ask the question, what uses do we want to make of our, I'm going to say river for shorthand. What are the uses that we make? And by we, I mean not just people, but aquatic life, wildlife, maybe even industry. What are the uses that we are either making right now of those water bodies or that we want to be able to make of those water bodies? So they might be aspirational goals. They might be current kind of status quo goals. So examples of designated uses, they really vary from state to state, but you see here a couple uses that are pretty common. One might be a cold water fishery. So perhaps it's a trout stream. Trout are spawning and reproducing, and that is a use that the community and the state wants to protect. Another example might be a recreational use like swimming, often called something like primary contact recreation, but the idea that this is a place where people are swimming or immersing themselves, maybe a local swimming hole, a beach, that kind of thing. Those get back to that goal that I put up in the introduction about fishable and swimmable waters as one of the national goals for the Clean Water Act. These would be examples that would fit within there. So designated uses are simply a way in your state policy to identify the uses we are making or want to make of a particular water body or section of a water body. It may even be just a section of stream or part of a lake. And this is really where that localization comes into play. For each stretch of river, for each lake, you can look up your designated uses in your water quality standards. And again, I'll show you some examples in the next slide. Associated with designated uses, once you've assigned those uses, the state then will establish associated water quality criteria. This is what we usually tend to think of when we think of standards, because we think of something, a standard sounds like something you can measure. But the criteria are really that piece. And what those criteria do is say, well, for the designated uses that we've identified on this stretch of river, let's say, what do we need to have in terms of water quality to make sure that that use is protected, that we're able to see, say, spawning trout in that cold water fishery? So in the example here, it might be a minimum amount of dissolved oxygen that you want in that stream at any point in order to make it a healthy place for those trout. Water quality criterion can be minimums, like you have in this example. Might be a maximum, say, of a heavy metal. You don't want any more than a certain amount. It could be a range. For example, pH is often presented as an acceptable range in a criteria. And it can also be a narrative description. The examples I've given you so far, like the one here on the slide, are numeric, and what we kind of think of, again, as a measurable. But we'll also see some examples in the next slides of narrative descriptions. And these narrative standards can be hard to implement, but they're also really powerful and necessary, because you could never establish a number for every single possible pollutant or problem that might be out there in the universe. So these narrative descriptions usually describe a good situation that is something to aspire to or a bad situation to avoid. Again, I'll show you an example that'll make the narrative criteria a little clearer. And then the third piece here is a kind of different creature, and we're only going to be able to touch on it today given the time we have. But the third piece of standards, which is often kind of forgotten, is this anti-degradation policy. And the idea in a nutshell behind anti-degradation is that where we have good quality, healthy systems, we don't want to allow that system to be degraded until the point where it just barely meets water quality criteria. So the anti-degradation policy has several pieces. We'll talk about kind of the 3 tiers of protection. But the important thing to keep in mind with anti-degradation is it's really about that maintain part of the Clean Water Act's objective, that we don't want to have every water body kind of be degraded until it's just barely safe for swimming or just barely supporting those trout. So we'll come back to anti-degradation and talk a little bit more about that. So the next thing I wanted to do here is talk about each of those 3 pieces with a few examples so you can kind of get a feel for how it plays out in the real world. I pulled from Minnesota some examples of the state's designated uses. I believe Minnesota actually calls them beneficial uses. Same idea. And you can see here that Minnesota has 7 classes that they identify for designated uses, and they run the gamut from drinking water to aquatic life, kind of a very general aquatic life use class, to industrial uses, to something called limited resource value waters, which many states have, kind of a generic class of waters that are limited in what they can support. So something to keep in mind here is if you looked at the way these uses are assigned on the ground in Minnesota, you'd find that many water bodies have many of these uses assigned. There's not just one. It's not only a drinking water source, for example. It might be a drinking water source, Class 1, and also be Class 2 for aquatic life and recreation. Might also be used for industrial use and cooling. But there's multiple designated use classes that could be applicable in most cases. The thing to keep in mind is that the most sensitive use has to be protected if the state's making any decisions, say with a pollution discharge permit. So if a stream was designated for industrial use and cooling, but also for aquatic life, in many cases that aquatic life use is going to be more sensitive, say to dissolved oxygen or maybe a heavy metal, and that would be the use that would be the one that would be focused on. But a couple things to take away here. You can see that there's a lot of different uses. Remember that multiple uses can be assigned, and that the most sensitive use is the one that would need to be protected. So that's from Minnesota. For water quality criteria here, I have a couple examples, one from Indiana and one from Ohio. I'm sorry for the small font on this slide, but I wanted you to see this is actually a snippet from the regulations in Indiana, so you can see kind of how these really look in the real world. So in Indiana here, what I've pulled here is an example of aquatic life use water quality criteria. So you can see here that the designated use is very closely tied to the idea of water quality criteria, just like I said in our first slide there. So where you have an aquatic life designated use, as you see in the first box, in the second red box there, you can see that they establish the dissolved oxygen criteria. So the other thing to take away from this slide is you can see that they establish several kind of measurements or criteria here. They have an average per day for dissolved oxygen, and then they also have a minimum that can't be kind of dropped below at any time. So in the case of Indiana, if you have aquatic life, you have several dissolved oxygen criteria that need to be considered to see if the water is supporting its designated use. You can see there's also some criteria in the snippet for temperature, for pH, for several other situations that might come into play to protect aquatic life. So my second example is an example of the narrative criteria that I mentioned. These can be a little hard to get your head around, so I wanted to give you a snippet. This is directly out of Ohio's water quality standards. And this is just two pieces from a longer list. I forget, it was like A through F or G. It's a long list of these examples, but it's a good example of how narrative criteria are usually written. We often call these the free from kind of standards. My favorite is always the free from scum. I like the scum standard. But you can see here that what they're trying to do is describe some desirable situations, things that you want in your water body that might be really hard to put a actual numeric criterion in place for. Free from scum, is that, I guess that's no scum, that's zero scum. You're not trying to establish some particular measurement of how much scum would be acceptable. So these are really powerful in that they can cover a lot of situations without having to establish that concrete number. You can see, though, that they're also a challenge, and the question is how you translate these criteria into things like, say, a pollution discharge permit or a total maximum daily load. When you have a number, it's easier to plug it into a lot of the systems that the Clean Water Act has established for protecting and restoring rivers. But just because it's not easy doesn't mean that they don't have to do it. So these narrative criteria carry just as much in terms of the force of law as a numeric criteria. It's important to keep in mind and be familiar with how your state's narrative criteria read and how they might be useful in your watershed. So with that, this is truly text-heavy, but again, I wanted to show you just a little snippet of how these look in your state regulations. This is an example of anti-degradation language in policy. Again, it's a very big topic and a topic I'm really passionate about, so we'll just scratch the surface today. The important things to remember about anti-degradation, again, is this is about kind of holding the line on water quality and not letting everything be degraded to where it just barely meets water quality criteria. So you probably can't read this on this slide, but in this section, it starts with 1, 2, and 3, and those correlate with the federal kind of approach to anti-degradation. The federal floor that was established is this idea of 3 tiers of protection, and most states have some version of this in their rules. Tier 1 is basically holding the line and just saying that you can't write a discharge permit or take another action in the state that you know will remove an existing use. So if you have a use in place, you can't knowingly wipe it out. You have to hold the line by protecting those uses. Tier 2 protections are where a lot of the actual rubber hits the road with the anti-degradation policy. Tier 2 says where you have better quality than just barely supporting your designated uses. Maybe you have higher dissolved oxygen in that trout stream or lower amounts of a particular metal that you're concerned about. That level, that better water quality needs to be protected unless the discharger can prove that there's no alternative to that, to degrading that good quality water, and that the degradation will support important local economic or social development. So it's not saying you can never degrade water quality, but it's saying we're gonna put you to some tests to say, yeah, we really want to make this societal decision to degrade that water quality. And again, you still can't remove those designated uses, the existing uses that are in place. And Tier 3 is kind of a special tier of protection. It says there are some water bodies out there that are so special that we really do want to say just no degradation of water quality in these waters. Examples that are often given are, blue ribbon trout streams, really popular recreation areas, places in parks, that kind of situation. Those Tier 3 waters are often called outstanding national resource waters or outstanding state resource waters in some cases. And you can see here, if you squint, Indiana has in Section 3 here, in Section 2.3, they've listed a couple water bodies in A, B, and C that they have given this special protection to. And that just means no degradation will be allowed. So again, there's a lot we could talk about in anti-degradation. The important take-home message is if you're not familiar with your state's policy, it's a really good thing to kind of look into, bone up on, and think about, well, in places in my watershed where I'm maybe not, struggling to restore water quality, how might this anti-degradation idea be better applied, particularly if you have maybe some of these special Tier 3 type water bodies. One last slide before we take some standards questions is just to reiterate that this program, the standards program, is part of the tiered approach that I talked about in the introduction. The states are generally the ones setting their water quality standards. So they're identifying the designated uses, they're establishing those water quality criteria, and they're setting up and implementing that anti-degradation policy. So this is really happening at the state level with a lot of local input. US EPA does retain, again, that oversight authority, so they set policy, establishing kind of that floor, they recommend criteria, and they retain oversight of the standards themselves, so they review and either approve or disapprove what the states have done. The other thing to keep in mind is that to some extent, standards are developed by the public. There's an extensive public involvement piece to the standards program. And actually, I just realized I do have one more slide in the standards section because I wanted to focus in on that a little bit for you all. That's this slide about changing standards. So the way the public really can get involved in water quality standards is usually through the triennial review. So every 3 years, your state is supposed to review their water quality standards and make any updates necessary. It might be changing designated uses, might be strengthening water quality criteria, could be any piece of their standards packet is open for review during that triennial review. Ohio is kind of in the midst of a triennial review, it looks like, a pretty long process. They had a June 6th this year, 2011, comment deadline, but it looks like what they did is kind of throw things wide open to comment, and now we'll be coming back to the public for more input later in the year in that process. And similarly, Minnesota has a goal of completing their triennial review in 2012, so they're in the process right now. And in fact, it looked like, the best I could tell is that their target is to finish the review, or at least publish a final rule by June 2012, taking comment probably somewhere like January. So you can see the states are really active. There's a real chance to get involved during that process. You could also always petition your state for a change at any time in your water quality standards package. And there's an official process to go through to kind of trigger that petition. But the triennial review is this rolling opportunity for involvement, and particularly for people working at the watershed level, is a great place for you to bring your local knowledge to the table. Even the best state agency, the most well-intentioned staff are not going to know the specifics of a watershed as well as the people who are working in that watershed. So, for example, those designated uses, when you look at those, you might see, well, that's crazy that the section that's protected for spawning habitat, it only includes these 2 miles. It actually stretches all the way up into the headwaters. You can bring that kind of information in through things like the triennial review process. So it's a really great place for local input and involvement. So lastly here, standards can seem pretty abstract, so I wanted to make sure that I pointed out that a lot of the other programs really do rely on having strong water quality standards. If you don't have the right designated uses and the right water quality criteria as a result of that, a lot of other work you do is going to be pointed toward the wrong goal. So point source discharge permit limits might not be set at the level they should be to protect what's really needs protecting in the stream. Your TMDL restoration effort might be pointed toward the wrong goal. Even things like, designing appropriate monitoring kind of approaches can be off-kilter if we're not looking at the right designated uses and the right criteria as we design those. So just even though it's kind of vague and hard sometimes to get your arms around, the Water Quality Standards Program is the core of everything else that we might want to do in our watershed with the Act. So, gosh, I keep saying it's the last standard slide. I forgot that I put these engagement slides in as well. I wanted to give you guys at least one place to get started with digging deeper. This is not your state program website because, again, we've got several states on, but it's a link through EPA that is a handy kind of one-stop link for all the states in Region 5, which is essentially the Great Lakes states. So that's a place to get started if you don't know where your state standards live on the web, that kind of thing. You can get there through this kind of portal. And I've also included here just a few ideas for getting involved. Most importantly is getting involved in your state's triennial review. Get on any kind of mailing list or email list they have to let people know about that process and make sure that you share what you know about your watershed. So with that, I'm actually at a question slide. So I'll ask Joe maybe if he's seen any questions already and encourage people to use the chat function on your screen to send in any questions. I've been talking a long time.
Yeah, none yet. Hopefully folks will take advantage of the chat box for questions, but I have one for you.
Sure.
Merritt. You talked about the standards overall for each state, but thinking in terms of an individual water body or watershed, and the designation that is given to that is going to, as you pointed out, determines sort of the targets. And the higher level designation is going to mean that the targets are going to be much lower as far as toxics and nutrients and sediments and things like that. Mm-hmm. So once a person has found out what the standards are for their particular watershed, how might they participate in reviewing the standards for their water body and determining if maybe they shouldn't be set a little higher? I know, for example, in Ohio, we have, for our aquatic life use designation, we have like warm water habitat, exceptional warm water habitat, and modified warm water habitat, and each one of those is sort of at a different level of quality. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, a stream may be downgraded or upgraded, say from modified warm water habitat to warm water, or from warm water to exceptional. Does an individual potentially have a role in determining, can they petition to have it set at a higher standard, or if it's going to be set at a lower standard, to try to prevent that from happening?
Yes. So two ways to answer that question. In the case of particularly in the case of an upgrade, in the case of both, but especially in the case of an upgrade, the triennial review process is really the best place to advocate for that. So the state, as part of that process, is supposed to look at all their designated uses, but as a reality check, if somebody brings information to the table to point out that, hey, we think that this particular, say, warm water fishery really qualifies as an exceptional warm water fishery, that's going to really help the state in terms of going through that review. There's just a lot of these sections to look at. So the triennial review is a great place to bring those kinds of questions and or data. Each state has a different process for what they really need in terms of information to justify, say, an upgrade. But local information, say volunteer monitoring information, that kind of data is really invaluable to the state agency during that process. So you might see what the state is proposing. They may already be proposing to change some designated uses, but you can also certainly bring your own proposals for changes to the table and submit those via comment or at public hearings, that kind of thing. Triennial review would be the best place. You could also petition, which is a little legally more technical, goes beyond the 101 section kind of level, but you can petition at any time for that kind of change. In terms of a downgrade to use, the Clean Water Act requires a pretty rigorous process if you're downgrading uses in most cases. The idea being we don't want to have kind of a slippery slope where maybe there's a problem that develops in a stream and the answer instead of restoring the stream is to just downgrade the use. So there's a process called a use attainability analysis that the state agency has to go through in most cases where they're trying to downgrade designated use. And so that's a pretty rigorous process. It usually is proposed, it can be proposed as part of the triennial review, but often has its own kind of public notice process, et cetera, as well, because it can be pretty controversial when you're looking at downgrading a use. But I would really encourage people to advocate for use changes through the triennial review process. For example, here in Utah, during a triennial review, I realized at one point that none of our waters were designated, did not have designated uses for swimming, for immersion. We call it primary contact recreation. None of them. We have, thousands and thousands of people come and raft our rivers and swim and, swimming holes for kids and all that stuff. And there wasn't 1 inch protected for swimming. So we advocated through the triennial review to change that, and the state, looked at it and said, yeah, that's reasonable, and made some pretty significant changes. Does that answer your question, Joe?
Yes, it does. Thank you. And just as a time check, we got about 15 minutes left.
Yeah. But that was our longest section. So the next couple here we can move through in a little bit quicker manner, especially since it sounds like people have been pretty involved in these. But we would be remiss if we didn't talk about what's probably the most well-known program under the Clean Water Act, and that is the Point Source Discharge Permitting Program, known as the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES program, federally. In most states, the states have, again, been delegated this program and taken it on. They have their own name for it. Instead of national, they stick their state name in. So here it's the UPDES program. In Ohio, it's the Ohio Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. The most important thing to know about this program is what it fundamentally did when the Act established this program was say it's illegal to discharge pollutants without a permit in our country. So it didn't actually say you can't discharge, but it said you can't discharge without a permit. The program is focused on point sources of pollution, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And it's also important to know that the application of this program has really evolved over the years. In the 70s, it was largely focused on wastewater treatment plants and industrial facilities. It has evolved to take in a lot of stormwater situations, concentrated animal feeding operations, things that were included in the initial vision of the program, but it's just taken us time to bring some of these discharges into the umbrella of the program. But these days, it's a very broad program, not just about your typical pipe. Again, this is part of the tiered approach where it's largely delegated to the states to run, but EPA retains their oversight authority. So animation isn't working on this slide, but sorry for all the text on this slide, but it's worth talking a little bit about what a point source is, because there is some confusion because of the evolution of this program. This is the actual language from the regulations, not the Act, but the implementing regulations at the federal level. The thing to take away from this is the first little snippet there is talking about what we might think about when we think of a point source, which is a conveyance, a pipe of some sort. So a discrete conveyance is a point source. The second snippet, they give some examples to make this more concrete, including the idea of a pipe. But it goes on from there to include a lot of other things that you might not think of, things like rolling stock, discrete fissures. You see here the concentrated animal feeding operation idea, even things like vessels, like boats. So this idea that we have in our mind of a pipe is part of the picture, but the Act is really thinking about something much broader when they talk about it, when it talks about a point source. The next little snippet there makes it clear that what they're talking about is those kinds of situations where pollutants are discharged or may be discharged. It's important to keep in mind because a lot of things aren't discharging around the clock 24/7, 365 days a year, like maybe a wastewater treatment plant, but there are places where pollutants may be discharged. For example, stormwater situations where when it rains you get a discharge. And then the last section there exempts several things from this definition of point source, including irrigated agriculture and agriculture stormwater runoff. So even though those might otherwise look like they very much fit into this definition, they're explicitly exempted from the program. So two types of permits to know about in the Clean Water Act system. It sounds like a lot of you might be familiar with this, but I want to make sure you understand that the idea of a permitting program, as a lay person, we often would think, well, so if there's one of these point sources of pollution like a wastewater treatment plant, that wastewater treatment plant then gets its own permit and it's specific to the site and kind of has safety mechanisms in place that it will make that plant safe from a water pollution standpoint. And in some cases that's true. Those are called individual permits. They're site-specific, designed for the specific situation, very concrete requirements for that particular facility. There's also, though, a group of permits known as general permits. And these permits are developed for a category of activity within a political or a geographic region. And the idea is that these categories, a category of activity, is an activity that has a similar type of operation or discharge, and so can have a very similar permit. They can be generally written, these permits, to cover multiple facilities and still make sure that there's good practices in place. So general permits are, if you want to think of it this way, they're kind of a way to cover a lot of dischargers with less work, with less resources from the state. General permits, they usually are developed every 5 years, and they're put out for public comment at that time. Then after they're finalized, anybody that can be covered under that general permit simply applies for coverage and receives that coverage under kind of an umbrella like you see here in this graphic. So one of the fundamental differences for you all between these two permits is the fact that with an individual permit, you get individual public notice and comment. So as a member of the public, as a watershed group, you can see what is proposed in your watershed and you can submit specific comments on that proposal. With a general permit, you do not get that opportunity. You do get the opportunity to comment every 5 years when the state revises the permit, but you may not know at that point that that general permit is going to be of concern in your watershed. You might not know that, say, a concentrated animal feeding operation is going to move in 2 years from now and apply to be covered under that general permit. So from a conservation perspective, the public notice and comment is a really important difference between these individual and general permit groups. So a little bit more, I've touched on some of this. The individual permits, again, are usually for things like wastewater treatment plants and major dischargers, some stormwater discharges, and the what here is just, again, that they are very specific permits for the specific site, and they get their own public comment period, usually 30 days, sometimes more. So they have this mechanism for you to get involved at the watershed level. Oops, I went too far. General permits, by contrast, again, are meant to cover similar operations with similar issues that can have, say, the same type of monitoring requirements or the same types of best management practices required of them. And again, they just apply to be covered under this general permit, and you do not get the chance to submit public comments on the specific site's proposal. You just can do it when the general permit is out for review. So I wanted to give you an example here. This is, again, from Ohio. You have a long list of general permits in Ohio. It actually covers 2 slides here. But you can see the types of activities that Ohio, at least, has decided are kind of similar in operation. You can write a general permit that's going to cover however many of those activities come in for coverage under the permit, and that will be kind of a resource-saving approach for them. So you see things here like CAFOs, non-contact cooling water, things you might expect, CAFOs you hear a lot about. Sometimes those do get individual permits, but in Ohio it looks like largely general. And then a lot of the stormwater permits in Ohio are general permits. You can see here several different kinds of stormwater permits that are included, including some watershed-specific permits, which is Ohio's not the only state to do, but it's one of only a few states to really try that approach of looking at an entire watershed and writing a general permit for that geographic area. So this is just a short list of what's in a permit. We don't really have time to look at the specifics of a permit, so I just wanted you to know that permit contains a lot of different information that if you're reviewing it and wanting to write comments, you have the opportunity to really dig into. Includes things like the anti-degradation analysis if they're proposing to degrade water quality, the specific pollutant limits for the facility, and a lot of other information like monitoring requirements, et cetera, that can be useful for a watershed group to know and understand and comment on if appropriate. Again, I'm giving you kind of a portal here to get to your state's program for permits through Region 5. And the important thing is to sign up for public notices so you know when these permits are proposed in your watershed. You can get those individual permit notices and also learn a little bit about general permits that might be up in your watershed. And a reminder that at least for individual permits, you get that 30 days or sometimes more to comment on the individual permits. And again, this is a place where people with local knowledge can make a huge impact and just know things that others will not know about your river or your local watershed. So we moved through that pretty quickly. Any questions on point source permits?
None in the chat yet, Merritt, but just to clarify, so municipalities of a certain size are required to have a stormwater discharge permit. Does that fall under that category of point source permits? And since a lot of that stormwater is really more of a non-point, how does that work with the municipality having a discharge permit when it's covering a lot of private land and a lot of runoff that's coming off areas that they don't even control?
Right. The stormwater angles are a very complicated part of the point source program. It is, to get to your first part of your question, it is a point source discharge permit. Those are through the NIPDES or your state equivalent program. It is considered a point source of pollution, even though, like you say, it's collecting from a very large area often. It's collecting into that stormwater system and is a point source. Probably beyond the 101 level to try to describe how cities and municipalities are wrestling with that. It is something we could do a whole webinar on if people are interested. One of my colleagues is a stormwater expert. But most of the stormwater permitting requirements focus on best management practices as their required components. So they're a little different than some permits. For example, they might focus on education and outreach programs to stop people from, say, dumping things down the stormwater drains. They might have requirements for street sweeping to minimize stuff coming off the roads. It's much more of a best management practice approach in a lot of those permits.
Okay, thanks. We got about 6 more minutes.
Yep, we're getting there. All right, well, the non-point source program is next, and I can tell that this one, this is going to be truly 101 for those of you on the line, so I'll move through this relatively quickly. The 319 program, as it's called under the Clean Water Act, is the Act's attempt to get at non-point source pollution in a similar way to the point source program we just talked about. It's very different in that it's not at all regulatory. It's not about permits and effluent limits. But what the Act 319 program said was, well, we want the states to assess their non-point source problem. That's the first piece. We want them to then establish a program for controlling that problem. And then we're going to establish some funding pass-through from the federal government to the states to help support on-the-ground work to address those problems that have been identified through the program. So mostly what we hear about is that grant program, number 3, but it's important to remember it is connected to this larger vision of how what your state sees as its core problems for non-point source pollution, and this program they've developed to address those problems. And the grants are really about implementing it. sounds like from our little survey at the beginning, I don't need to tell you guys to apply for this money. A lot of people, it sounds like, are doing it. It's important also, though, to look at your state's assessment and plan, those first two pieces. A lot of states haven't updated those in a long time. So you may want to work with your state to update those, to address the issues that really matter to you, and then to make the linkages between the nonpoint source program and the rest of your state's water quality work stronger. The 319 grants are very closely tied to the identification of problems. But for example, your state has other funding programs that could be tied to the problems identified through 319. That could be a really powerful tool. A lot of states aren't necessarily making those connections very well. So it is about the grant money, but it's also important to work with your state to make sure that the problems that are identified are the priorities in your watershed, and that the plan for solving them is connected up with that grant money. So I won't go into any more detail on that. I was going to spend a little more time, but it sounds like that's where you guys are spending most of your time already. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to address them. And otherwise, I'll just move on to TMDLs before we run out of time. No? Okay. Well, so this is the other program it sounds like you guys work on quite a bit. So I'll just touch on it here as we close and say that the Clean Water Act's vision for restoring waters that aren't meeting water quality standards is relatively straightforward, despite the fact that we've all made it really complicated. So the Act just said, Congress said, let's do three things where we find there's problems. We're going to identify the waters not meeting standards. We're going to prioritize those waters for their restoration. And then we're going to develop what's called a total maximum daily load to restore them. So a TMDL, you'll hear a lot of different opinions about what that third step really means. But a total maximum daily load is three things in my mind. It's a calculation of the maximum safe amount of a pollutant we can put in the water before we're going to violate our water quality criteria and cause problems. It's also a plan for cleanup. So if you've got a problem, what are you going to do about it? And perhaps most practically, it's a mechanism for just bringing a lot of these programs and tools to bear on a problem. So those of you that are working in watersheds that have been identified as impaired through the TMDL program know that there's a lot of prioritization for funding that comes along with that kind of designation, a lot of more attention placed on pollution discharge permit limits. It really is should be a way to coordinate a lot of the programs in the Act to try to solve this problem. I think that's the most practical way to think about TMDLs, even though there's a lot of complications that go along with the program. So I won't go through too much of this because it's so different from state to state, but in its most generic form, the process for developing a TMDL is, again, something that's relatively simple and incredibly complicated. But each state does go through and say, all right, where we have a problem, we're going to figure out how much, what's our pollution cap, how much of this problem pollutant can we put into water before we're going to have problems. They also go through and identify and quantify the sources of that pollutant. And then they basically divvy up the pie. They say, well, to stay under that cap, here's what we can give each of the sources we've identified in terms of their own contribution to the problem in the watershed. And then there's this implement and monitor feedback loop. Again, each state does it quite differently. Ohio has a very, very well-developed TMDL program. It's a lot more gradations to the steps than this in Ohio. So again, here's a portal for connecting up a little more with your TMDL program in the state. And just know that at the watershed level, you can get involved in each of those three steps of the TMDL process. In the listing process, you are again going to have more local information about where problems are and what exactly those problems are than even the best state agency staff can, and also about prioritizing those problems. What is the community most worried about in terms of maybe public health concerns or that kind of concern? In the TMDL development process, it's great to have local input. There's always these stakeholder processes. There's opportunities for public comment. And then, of course, in implementation, a lot of you, it sounds like, are involved in restoration projects on the ground. It's the fun part of the TMDL process. So with that, I'll just take maybe one more question since it looks like we're right at the top of the hour. I'm sorry, I got a little squished there, but I'd be happy to stay on and take questions.
Yeah. Jared posted a question, Merritt. He asks, who's legally responsible for non-point source reductions that are identified in a TMDL. For instance, if your TMDL does not require additional point source reductions beyond existing permits, but instead says all reductions should come from the non-point load allocation, who is legally responsible for making sure that that reduction happens?
That's cutting right to the chase on TMDLs with that question. So I mentioned that the Clean Water Act's non-point source program is not a regulatory program. It's voluntary. So in the TMDL process, non-point source reductions that are required through a TMDL, it's kind of required in quotes. If your state has a non-point source regulatory program, they can use that. And several states do, at least for pieces of, types of non-point source problems. There are tools at the state level, but federally, this 319 program is voluntary. So the main thing that people can hang their hat on is U.S. EPA reviews and approves TMDLs. And as part of that review, the state has to prove that there is something called reasonable assurance that these reductions will occur. So technically, the EPA should be reviewing these TMDLs, and if there is no plan for actually implementing those non-point source reductions, no funding perhaps associated with those, maybe it's just almost physically impossible to get the proposed amount or degree of reduction from as they're proposing to do. Those types of things EPA should be reviewing, U.S. EPA should review and not agree to. They should disapprove the TMDL and send it back to the state. This reasonable assurance concept, though, is pretty vague and has been, proven really hard to implement. So it's a big problem with the TMDL program. But working with the state agency to ask questions about that reasonable assurance threshold and following up with U.S. EPA to make sure they hold the line is probably your best strategy given our current kind of legal structure, unless your state has enforceable non-point source requirements. A depressing answer.
Thanks, Garrett. And we will leave the WebEx open for a few more minutes for questions. I want to give a chance to folks who need to get off to do so at this point. But speaking of voluntary compliance, we do have an evaluation that you can voluntarily complete. We very much do appreciate and utilize the feedback that we get through the evaluations. And Brian Weaver just posted that down in the chat box. So you should be able to just click on the link in the chat box, complete the evaluation. Like I said, I think it's a 1 or 2 minute process, but we very much appreciate you doing that. And thanks a lot, Merritt, for the presentation, responding to the questions. And we'll leave the WebEx open here for a few more minutes. We'll stay on with Merritt for those who have some other questions that they'd like to ask. But otherwise, I want to say thanks a lot for being on the WebEx, and thanks to Merritt for the great presentation.
Well, thanks for having me. And I'm happy to stay on here for a bit. And I did post just a few resources here where you can learn more about any of the topics that we talked about, plus a lot of other Clean Water Act programs.
I also want to say thanks to your employer, Merritt River Network, for allowing you the time to do this activity for us.
It was fun.